Have you ever pondered how Indigenous rights have evolved in politics over the centuries? This is a question that untangles a complex web of history, struggle, advocacy, and recognition. It's a journey that takes us from the earliest civilizations to the modern political arena, where the voices of Indigenous people are becoming increasingly prominent. The evolution of Indigenous rights is not just a historical narrative, it's a vital aspect of our contemporary world. Join us on this enlightening journey as we explore the evolution of Indigenous rights from history to the present day. Our journey begins in the distant past, where Indigenous rights were a concept yet to be born. To understand the roots of Indigenous rights, we need to travel back in time to when Indigenous societies thrived, their cultures flourishing, their worldviews shaped by the land and nature. Yet, with the arrival of settlers from different continents, this world began to change. These settlers, driven by a desire for exploration, expansion, and exploitation, often disregarded the Indigenous societies they encountered. The Indigenous people's ways of life, their traditions, their lands, all were seen through a lens of primitive and uncivilized. This Eurocentric worldview disregarded the rich cultural heritage and complex societal structures of Indigenous peoples. This lack of recognition meant that Indigenous peoples were often marginalized, their rights neglected. Their lands were seized, their cultures suppressed, their languages erased. But even in the face of such adversity, the spirit of resistance among Indigenous peoples began to take root. The late 18th and early 19th centuries marked the beginning of a slow shift. Indigenous leaders started to resist the onslaught of settler colonialism, striving to protect their lands, their cultures, their identities. From Tecumseh's struggle in North America to the Maori resistance in New Zealand, Indigenous leaders stood tall, sparking the flame of Indigenous rights movements. The 20th century witnessed an intensification of these movements. The fight for recognition moved from the battlefields to the courtrooms, from violent confrontations to political negotiations. Indigenous peoples began to demand respect for their rights, their cultures, their lands. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the year 2007 was a significant milestone in this journey, a testament to the continued fight for Indigenous rights. This marked the beginning of a long struggle for Indigenous rights, a struggle that continues to this day. As we delve deeper into this topic, let's remember the resilience and courage of those who stood and continue to stand for Indigenous rights, for their rich heritage is a testament to their enduring spirit. As centuries passed, the world started to recognize the importance of Indigenous rights. The journey towards recognition wasn't a straight path. It was a winding road marked by a series of turning points, each contributing to the momentum for change. Let's delve into some of these pivotal moments that marked a shift in perspective. The first major turning point came in the mid-20th century, with the United Nations establishment in 1945. In the aftermath of two world wars, the international community was poised to promote peace and human rights, including Indigenous rights. In 1957, the International Labour Organization, a UN agency, adopted Convention 107, the first international treaty to recognize and protect Indigenous peoples' rights. The next significant milestone was the American Indian movement's birth in 1968. This grassroots movement, born out of the Civil Rights era, brought Indigenous rights into the spotlight, demanding respect for treaties, land rights, and cultural preservation. In the late 20th century, several countries took landmark steps to recognize Indigenous rights in their national laws. Canada's Constitution Act of 1982 recognized and affirmed existing Aboriginal rights, a first for the country. In the same decade, Australia's High Court recognized Indigenous land rights in the landmark Mabo decision. The turn of the 21st century saw a global shift towards acknowledging Indigenous rights. In 2007, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, setting an international standard for the treatment of Indigenous communities. This milestone was a testament to decades of advocacy and struggle. These turning points, from international treaties to grassroots activism, marked a shift in perspective towards Indigenous rights. They brought Indigenous issues into public consciousness and paved the way for further advancements. However, they were not the end of the journey, but rather stepping stones towards greater recognition and respect. These milestones were crucial in advancing Indigenous rights, yet there was still much to be achieved. In the modern political landscape, the fight for Indigenous rights has taken a new form. As we delve into the contemporary political arena, we find Indigenous rights at the forefront of many discussions, debates, and policy-making decisions. Advocacy groups play a crucial role in this evolving narrative, becoming the voices for those who have been historically marginalized. These groups work tirelessly to raise awareness, lobby for policy changes, and ensure that Indigenous voices are heard in the corridors of power. Political representation is another key aspect of Indigenous rights in modern politics. It's imperative to have Indigenous leaders in political offices, as they can bring first-hand experiences and unique perspectives to the table. They can help shape policies that not only acknowledge the past injustices, but also work towards a more equitable future. In recent years, we've seen a surge in Indigenous representation in politics. From local councils to the national stage, Indigenous politicians are making their mark, advocating for their communities, and influencing policy decisions. This increased representation is a significant step towards ensuring that Indigenous rights are not just recognized, but also protected and promoted. Legislation, of course, plays a pivotal role in the fight for Indigenous rights. Recent laws have been enacted that recognize Indigenous land rights, protect cultural heritage, and promote social and economic equity. These laws signal a shift in societal attitudes and a recognition of the importance of Indigenous rights in our political and social fabric. However, it's important to remember that legislation is a tool, not an end in itself. The effectiveness of these laws lies in their enforcement and in the broader societal acceptance and respect for Indigenous rights. While significant progress has been made, the fight for Indigenous rights continues, as new challenges emerge. As we move forward, it's essential to keep the conversation alive, to continue advocating, and to ensure that Indigenous rights remain a priority in our political discourse. After all, the struggle for Indigenous rights is not just about the rights of a particular group. It's about justice, equality, and the kind of society we want to be. Despite the progress, Indigenous communities still face numerous challenges in their fight for equality and recognition. The journey towards genuine political inclusion is a rocky one, fraught with obstacles that are both systemic and deeply ingrained in societal attitudes. Let's delve into the challenges. Indigenous individuals often lack representation in political decision-making processes. This lack of representation means their voices are often unheard, their interests overlooked, and their unique cultural perspectives undervalued. Moreover, Indigenous communities grapple with issues like land rights disputes, inadequate access to vital resources, and the preservation of their languages and cultures, issues that are often sidelined in mainstream political discourse. But it's not all doom and gloom. The tide is slowly turning. Around the world, advocacy efforts are gaining momentum. Indigenous activists and allies are tirelessly working to ensure Indigenous rights are firmly placed on the political agenda. They're harnessing the power of social media to amplify their voices, sharing their stories, and making the world listen. And these efforts are bearing fruit. More and more, we're seeing Indigenous people in positions of political power, making decisions that directly impact their communities. Governments are being pushed to recognize Indigenous sovereignty, and laws are gradually changing to protect Indigenous land rights and cultural heritage. Looking ahead, the future prospects for Indigenous rights in politics are promising. The path is certainly not easy, but the relentless spirit of Indigenous communities around the world is a beacon of hope. As more Indigenous people take up leadership roles, and as advocacy efforts continue to grow, the political landscape is slowly but surely changing. The journey of Indigenous rights in politics is far from over, but with continued advocacy and recognition, a brighter future is possible. Yes, there are hurdles. Yes, it's a long road, but the determination and resilience of Indigenous communities are driving this journey forward, towards a future where their rights are not just recognized, but celebrated. In this journey, we have traversed through centuries of struggle for Indigenous rights in politics. We began at the roots, where we witnessed the inception of the fight for Indigenous rights, a battle that was born out of the need for recognition, for respect, and for equality, a battle that is as old as the civilizations themselves. We then navigated through the turning point, where the world began to acknowledge the rights of the Indigenous people, a time when the world started to see the value of diversity and respect for all cultures, a time that marked the beginning of a new era for Indigenous rights. This led us to the exploration of Indigenous rights in modern politics. We saw how Indigenous people are now represented in political spaces, how they are influencing policymaking, and how they are shaping the future of their communities. But the journey doesn't end here. We then delved into the current struggles and the future prospects. We recognize that while significant strides have been made, there are still many challenges that lie ahead. The fight for Indigenous rights continues, and the future holds immense potential for further progress. As we look forward, let's remember the importance of recognizing and advocating for Indigenous rights for a more equitable and inclusive future.